Okay, so let's unpack this. Today, we're taking a deep dive into a topic that has, well, fundamentally shaped human history, ignited countless conflicts, and truly continues to define our world: nationalism.
It's a huge one.
Absolutely. And you've shared some incredible sources with me, especially those fascinating excerpts from The Science of Human Nationalism, an AI interdisciplinary analysis.
Yes, that analysis provides some really interesting frameworks.
So our mission today is to pull out the most important nuggets of knowledge from these sources, helping you truly understand what nationalism is, why it holds such, immense power over us.
And its implications.
Exactly. What its profound implications are for individuals, societies, and the entire global stage. We're also going to tackle a really provocative question you posed. Could humanity ever truly transcend national identities and simply identify as human?
That's the big question, isn't it? A challenging one.
Definitely. So get ready for some surprising facts, maybe a few aha moments, and hopefully a whole lot of insight.
What are we really talking about?
We hear the word nationalism all the time, especially in the news, but what does it truly mean? Like, what's its core definition?
Well, at its simplest, nationalism is a political principle. It says the state and the people within it, they should be congruent, one and the same.
Congruent, okay.
Yeah, aligned. It's basically an ideology emphasizing loyalty, devotion, allegiance to a nation or nation-state, where these obligations are meant to outweigh pretty much all other interests, individual ones, other group affiliations.
Everything else.
Pretty much. And what's really fascinating here, the sources point out, is how it suggests humanity is naturally divided into distinct nations.
Naturally, like it's just how things are meant to be.
That's the idea it promotes, and that being a member of your nation is your single most important social identity, demanding partiality.
Partiality, so favoring your own.
Exactly. The nationalist is expected to favor their own nation, even over family or religion in some interpretations. It's a powerful kind of mental rewiring.
Wow, wait, so nationalism essentially teaches us to put our nation above everything else, even family. How does it manage to create that intense, almost sacred loyalty among millions of strangers? It's kind of incredible.
It is incredible. And this is where Benedict Anderson's brilliant theory comes in the nation as an imagined community.
Imagined community, I've heard that phrase.
Right. A nation is imagined because its members, well, they'll never know most of their fellow citizens face to face. They're just too many.
Millions, yeah.
Yet, in their minds, they all hold this vivid image of their shared communion. It's not based on, genetic ties or direct interaction like in small pre-modern communities.
Okay, so not like a village where everyone knows everyone.
Exactly. Instead, it's a social construct. It's deliberately forged through shared cultural symbols, flags, anthems.
Things we see all the time.
Right, and standardized language pushed through mass media and a carefully curated idea of history, a shared story.
Ah, the shared story aspect. That seems key.
It is. It creates what Anderson called a deep horizontal comradeship. That feeling makes millions willing to die for this abstract imagining.
Die for an imagining.
The real power lies in making this modern construction feel ancient, natural, deeply personal. It's almost like a collective magic trick pulling this feeling out of thin air.
Okay, so we've broken down what nationalism is, but the way a nation chooses to define itself, that isn't just an abstract debate, is it? Our sources make it abundantly clear this choice has profoundly real-world consequences.
Oh, absolutely. The decision to define a nation based on shared civic values versus, say, shared ethnicity fundamentally shapes a state's entire trajectory.
How so?
Well, think about it. If a state defines itself along ethnic lines, history shows it's, more likely to produce exclusionary policy.
Like, you're not one of us.
Exactly. And to view its neighbors with deep suspicion. We've seen examples, 19th century Europe, more recent conflicts where ethnicity was tragically weaponized.
Okay, and the alternative, civic nationalism.
Right. Conversely, a nation founded on civic principles, shared laws, rights, a constitution typically fosters greater inclusivity, more peaceful coexistence, at least in theory.
So the very act of defining the nation, that's the first domino.
You could say that. It's really the first and most critical step in shaping the moral character of the state itself. It sets the tone for everything else.
Okay, that makes sense. Now, there's this central academic debate about where nationalism actually comes from. Was it, something that always existed deep in our past? Or is it a relatively new invention?
Yeah, that's a big one. The discussion largely divides into two camps. the modernists and the perennialists.
Modernists and perennialists, okay.
Modernist thinkers like Ernest Gellner, Benedict Anderson, Eric Hobsbawm, they argue that nations and nationalism are distinctly modern phenomena. They emerged only in the last few centuries.
So relatively recent in human history.
Exactly. Gellner famously claimed nationalism invents nations where they do not exist. He saw it as a tool, really.
A tool for what?
To create the kind of social homogeneity needed for industrial society, made possible by new technologies like print capitalism, mass printing, and mass education.
Print capitalism? How exactly did newspapers and books create nations? That sounds like a big leap.
It's fascinating, right? Think about it. Before mass printing, people spoke countless local dialects. Communication was limited.
Right, very fragmented.
But with standardized printing, suddenly huge numbers of people across a vast territory were reading the same newspapers, the same books, in the same standardized language.
Ah, okay. A shared language emerges.
Exactly. They're sharing the same stories, the same jokes, the same idea of history. This shared mental world, created and sustained by print, allowed millions of strangers to imagine themselves as part of one single community, a shared reality, mediated through print.
Wow. So from this modernist view, nationalism creates nations, not the other way around.
That's the core argument. It's not just revealing something that was already there.
Okay, so what about the other side, the perennialists?
Right, the perennialists and ethnosymbolists like Anthony D. Smith. They acknowledge nationalism's modern political form, but they argue its roots run much deeper.
Deeper how?
They argue that modern nations are often built upon pre-existing ethnic communities, what Smith called ethnies. These groups already had shared myths, memories, cultural elements.
So the raw materials were already there.
Kind of. Nationalism then reinterprets these older ties, draws immense emotional power from them. It taps into something ancient feeling.
Okay, so this isn't just historians arguing, is it? It has real implications for our future.
It really does. If the modernists are right, nationalism is contingent. It arose under specific historical conditions, so maybe it could be superseded by something else like cosmopolitanism, a global identity.
A post-national world.
Perhaps. But if the perennialists are closer to the truth, these deep-rooted ethnic or cultural attachments are far less transient. They're sticky, meaning any post-nationalist future would likely still need to accommodate these powerful cultural loyalties somehow. You couldn't just erase them. It really changes how you think about what's possible going forward.
Given all that complexity, it seems crucial to understand that nationalism isn't just one single thing. Our sources provide a really helpful breakdown of its different forms, don't they?
Yes, they do. And the most fundamental distinction they draw is between civic nationalism and ethnic nationalism.
Okay, let's break those down. Civic.
Civic nationalism is based on shared political values, allegiance to a constitution, a set of laws, rights. Theoretically, it's open to anyone who adopts those values. Think of the idealized versions of the US or France,
Based on ideas, not blood.
Right. Ethnic nationalism, on the other hand, is based on shared heritage, common descent, a specific cultural identity. It's inherently more exclusive.
Examples.
Think of 19th century German nationalism or Serbian nationalism in the 90s. These forms have a much higher potential for xenophobia and conflict, unfortunately.
And beyond that core distinction, civic versus ethnic, what other forms exist, this is where it gets even more complex and maybe more dangerous.
It can, yeah. We also see state nationalism. This is loyalty primarily to the state apparatus itself, often found in authoritarian regimes. Kemalist Turkey is often cited as an example.
Loyalty to the government, not necessarily the people or culture.
More emphasis on the state structure, yeah. Then there's cultural nationalism, which is focused on preserving a shared culture, language, art. The Maori language revitalization movement in New Zealand is a good example of this impulse.
Okay, that sounds potentially positive.
It can be, yes. But then you have religious nationalism, which defines the nation by a shared religion. It often seeks to align state law with religious doctrine. We see this debated intensely in places like India with Hindu nationalism or in various forms of political Islam.
Fusing faith and national identity.
Exactly. And then there's the highly dangerous form, expansionist nationalism. This is aggressive, militaristic, seeks territorial expansion. The most chilling example, of course, is Nazi Germany's pursuit of Lebensraum, or living space.
Right. That's the nightmare scenario.
Absolutely. So the specific form nationalism takes is absolutely critical. It determines so much about a nation's domestic stability and how it interacts with the rest of the world. Why do we feel this way? The deep roots of group identity.
Okay, so we understand the what and the types. But to truly grasp the immense power nationalism holds, we need to look beyond politics, don't we? Dive deep into our ancient origins, maybe even our biology.
You've got it. The story really begins long, long before nations even existed. It starts with human evolution in small hunter-gatherer groups.
Back to the savannah.
Pretty much. Tribalism, that tendency to form groups, it's a deeply ingrained adaptive trait. Forming close-knit cooperative groups offered profound survival advantages.
Like what?
Well, more effective hunting, for one. Efficient resource sharing. Better raising of offspring. It takes a village, right? And crucially, defense against threats, both animal and human.
Safety in numbers.
Exactly. And this fostered innate survival mechanisms. Things like kin selection, the drive to help your relatives because it helps your shared genes survive.
Makes sense.
And reciprocal altruism, which is basically, you scratch my back, I'll scratch yours. These were evolutionary shortcuts to building stronger group bonds, cementing powerful in-group loyalty.
But this groupishness, it must have had a dark side, right? The same forces that bind us together can also turn us against others.
That's a crucial point, absolutely. The very same evolutionary pressures that fostered in-group amity, that sense of us, simultaneously bred out-group suspicion and hostility them.
Us versus them. It's that fundamental.
It seems to be. Being able to rapidly distinguish us from them was likely a critical survival skill in a world of scarce resources and frequent intergroup competition.
So being suspicious of strangers could actually keep you alive.
Potentially, yes. And this capacity to unite against rivals, sometimes violently, conferred significant advantages on groups that were good at it. So the human mind evolved with this fundamental predisposition for the in-group imperative.
The in-group imperative.
It's the raw biological material, you could say, that nationalism would later find incredibly fertile ground in. It would mold and, yes, exploit this deep-seated instinct.
Exploit. That's a strong word. Are you saying nationalism is inherently manipulative or just incredibly effective at tapping into something primal?
It's certainly incredibly effective at tapping into it. Whether it's inherently it often is manipulated for political ends. It's a powerful tool.
So how does this ancient hardwiring actually manifest in our modern minds? Psychology must have something to say about this.
It does quite a bit. Several theories offer profound insights. First, there's social identity theory.
Okay.
This tells us that a significant part of our self-concept, who we think we are, comes from our group memberships. We automatically categorize ourselves and others into in-groups and out-groups.
It's automatic. We just do it.
Seems so. And this categorization immediately triggers biases. There's in-group bias. We view our group more favorably, see its members as varied, unique individuals.
We're diverse, complex.
Exactly. And then there's out-group homogeneity bias. We view them as all the same, interchangeable stereotypes.
We're all like, yeah, I can see that.
What's truly fascinating here is how powerfully this simple categorization drives both internal group cohesion and external prejudice. It does both jobs at once.
Wow. Okay, what else?
Then there's terror management theory, or TMT. This is a really interesting one.
Terror management sounds intense.
It is. It posits that a lot of human behavior is motivated, often unconsciously, by a deep fear of death, our own mortality.
Okay. How does that relate to nationalism?
Well, when we're reminded of our mortality, maybe through a crisis, a war, even just subtle cues, we seek security in things that seem to promise symbolic immortality, things bigger than ourselves that will last, like cultural worldviews, strong group identities. The nation, with a capital N nationalist fervor, often surges during times of crisis or uncertainty because these situations activate our deepest existential anxieties.
So clinging to the nation makes us feel safer, more permanent.
It can function that way, yes. Group identity becomes indispensable. It's almost like nationalism offers us a kind of immortality insurance against the terrifying reality of our own finite existence.
That's a powerful, slightly disturbing thought. Immortality insurance.
It puts a different spin on patriotism, doesn't it? And if we look at the neuroscience of tribalism, it gets even more concrete. Our brains are literally wired for group life.
Wired how?
fMRI studies show that seeing or interacting with in-group members activates our brain's reward centers. It feels good.
Okay.
But the amygdala, that's our brain's threat detection system, shows a heightened response to out-group faces, especially under certain conditions.
So threat detection kicks in for them.
It can, yeah. And get this, the neurohormone oxytocin, often called the love hormone, or cuddle chemical.
Yeah, makes you bond.
It does, within the in-group. It enhances trust and bonding with us. But paradoxically, the same hormone can actually increase suspicion and defensiveness against the outgroup.
Whoa. So oxytocin isn't just universal love, it's tribal love.
In many ways, yes. It seems to be the neurochemical agent of the use versus them instinct. It sharpens the line.
So the need for group identity seems absolutely fundamental. That's a powerful revelation from the sources. But if that's the case, where does the danger come in? How does that natural impulse get twisted into something negative?
The danger often lies in how that need is fulfilled, and critically, how it gets scaled up. And our sources also highlight a deeply gendered aspect to this, particularly regarding conflict.
Gendered? How so?
Well, intergroup conflict warfare, raiding has been strikingly male-dominated throughout history and prehistory.
Right. The stereotype is male warriors.
And the male warrior hypothesis suggests there might be an evolutionary basis for this. It proposes that male psychology has been shaped over millennia by the adaptive benefits of forming coalitions, bands of males, specifically for aggression against other groups.
Aggression for what purpose? Resources. Mates.
Likely both. Access to resources, status, reproductive opportunities. This strategy could have led to strong selection pressures favoring a distinct warrior psychology in men.
Which includes?
Things like higher average levels of xenophobia, ethnocentrism, a greater readiness to dehumanize outgroups to make aggression easier. Nationalist rhetoric often taps directly into these predispositions by valorizing specifically masculine projections of honor, bravery, sacrifice, duty to the nation. The imagery is often very male-coded.
That's a stark observation.
Yeah.
What about women's role in this evolutionary dynamic then?
Women's evolutionary pressures regarding intergroup conflict were likely quite different. Conflict brought significant risks for women: abduction, sexual coercion, loss of offspring.
Terrible risks.
Indeed. This may have selected for a female psychology characterized more by heightened fear and avoidance of outgroup men, perhaps especially during fertile phases of the cycle when the reproductive stakes are highest.
So different pressures, different responses.
Potentially, yes. It suggests nationalist conflicts aren't just, rational political calculations. They're often fueled by these fundamental, deeply emotional, evolutionary drives related to status, mating, coalitional violence drives that might be particularly potent on average in males.
Okay, so if tribalism is this ancient, deeply ingrained part of us, hardwired over millennia, how did we get to the modern nation state? It's still wild to think our brains are wired for tiny tribes of maybe 150 people, and yet we're supposed to feel that same bond with, say, 300 million strangers. That's a serious scaling issue.
It is a massive scaling issue, and that's precisely why the nation-state is truly a modern invention. But, and this is key, it was an invention that successfully co-opted or hijacked this ancient psychological operating system.
Hijacked it.
Well, a couple of things happened historically. First, the decline of older, universalizing identities like Christendom or the old feudal order created an identity vacuum. People felt dislocated, adrift, needing a new form of social cohesion.
A gap needed filling.
Exactly. Second, the rise of the modern state provided the tools to fill this void. We talked about Anderson's print capitalism.
Right, the newspapers, the books.
That created unified communication fields in common vernacular languages. It allowed people across vast distances who would never meet to imagine themselves as part of a single linguistic community, reading the same things, thinking about the same issues.
And education.
Mass standardized education was crucial too. It entrenched the national language, taught a common state-sanctioned version of history, drilled national myths and symbols.
So nationalism became the cultural glue for this entirely new kind of society, the modern industrial state.
Precisely. It took that raw, powerful, ancient human instinct for in-group loyalty, an instinct evolved for small, concrete, kin-based tribes, and successfully redirected it toward a new, completely abstract object, the imagined community of millions of strangers.
That hijacking, as you call it.
It explains nationalism's incredible, often terrifying power. It explains why this relatively recent historical artifice feels so ancient and timeless to us.
And it also explains its lethality.
Tragically, yes.
Dark.
Because when you take those ancient tribal instincts, us versus them, loyalty, suspicion, potential for aggression, and you harness them to the power of a modern bureaucratic state with a professional army, industrial capacity, and weapons of mass destruction, the consequences can be and have been catastrophic. The impact of nationalism, how it reshapes our world. So thinking about the impact. For the individual, nationalism is definitely, as the sources suggest, a double-edged sword.
How so? Good and bad.
Exactly. On the positive side, it can offer profound psychological benefits. a sense of identity, belonging, security. It fulfills a fundamental human need to connect with something larger than oneself.
Right, that feeling of being part of something significant.
Yes, fostering what psychologists call self-transcendence. It can also underpin a healthy sense of patriotism, an effective attachment, a love for one's homeland and culture, but without necessarily feeling superior to others.
Okay, so patriotism isn't inherently bad.
Not necessarily. And interestingly, neurobiological studies even suggest different brain regions might be activated for this kind of patriotism versus the more assertive kind of nationalism, distinct processes.
But there's a much darker side, isn't there? That's what we usually mean by nationalism in a negative sense.
There is. The darker side, often what's termed nationalism in psychological studies, involves a belief in national superiority, a desire for national dominance, and the active derogation or looking down on other nations.
And that leads to...
It correlates strongly with greater prejudice, xenophobia, and a readiness to endorse aggression towards other groups or nations.
And this comes back to that scaling problem.
Exactly. It's that critical scale mismatch we talked about. Psychological mechanisms evolve for small, face-to-face groups that get applied to immense nation-states of millions. This inevitably casts other entire nations as monolithic outgroups, potential threats.
So the good feeling of belonging is local, but the hostility can become global.
That's a good way to put it. The positive effect of cohesion is localized within the nation, while the potential for intergroup hostility becomes globalized between nations.
Okay, so that's the individual level.
Yeah.
How does nationalism, this powerful force, actually reshape society itself? You mentioned culture, religion, law.
It acts as a really powerful force of social engineering, shaping the very fabric of society. Take culture. Nationalism actively constructs and standardizes it.
How does it construct culture?
By promoting a single national language over regional dialects or minority languages, by creating national holidays, rituals, ceremonies that everyone participates in, by elevating certain forms of art or literature as national, and crucially, by disseminating official historical narratives, national myths.
Myths that emphasize unity and greatness, maybe glossing over the bad stuff.
Often, yes. This whole process is inherently an act of power. It involves choosing what's national and, by definition, excluding or suppressing inconvenient histories and minority cultures that don't fit the narrative. It raises a really important question. Who gets to decide what the nation remembers and what it's forced to forget?
That's a heavy question. What about religion?
Nationalism's relationship with religion is complex. In some contexts, particularly secular ones, nationalism almost becomes a kind of secular religion itself.
How do you mean?
It fills the void perhaps left by declining traditional faith. The nation becomes the supreme object of devotion with its own sacred texts, martyrs, rituals.
I see.
More explicitly, though, we see religious nationalism where faith and national identity are deliberately fused. The nation is seen as divinely chosen, its destiny ordained. This can, unfortunately, lead quite directly to discrimination and conflict against those of other faiths, or no faith within the nation.
And the law. How does nationalism shape our legal systems?
Fundamentally, nationalism dictates law around who belongs. Immigration and citizenship laws are prime examples, almost always favoring co-nationals. It shapes economic laws, like trade protectionism to shield domestic industries.
Prioritizing us economically.
Yes. In states with strong religious nationalism, religious doctrine can directly influence judicial rulings and legislation. It also defines criteria for political leadership, demanding that leaders prioritize supposed national interests above all else. This can pave the way for populist and authoritarian figures who claim to embody the will of the nation.
That suggests a fundamental tension with universal principles, like human rights, doesn't it?
It absolutely does. Nationalism tends to shift the basis of law away from universal principles, which apply to everyone, towards particularist interests, the interest of this specific nation. This creates a structural conflict between national law and international law, or universal human rights declarations.
And when this national focus is projected onto the world stage,
when projected globally, nationalism often proves detrimental to peace. It drives foreign policy, often framing international relations as a zero-sum game.
Meaning my nation's gain is your nation's loss.
Exactly. A perpetual competition for power, resources, prestige. This inevitably leads to a more fractured, suspicious, and conflict-prone world.
So if it's all about competition and zero-sum games, what does this all mean for global cooperation, especially when we face massive challenges, climate change, pandemics that clearly demand unity?
It means nationalism poses a fundamental, ongoing challenge to effective global governance. These huge transnational issues require collective action. But nationalist states are often deeply reluctant to participate fully. They fear any loss of sovereignty, any constraint on their freedom of action, or they're unwilling to bear costs if those costs might also benefit other nations, even rivals.
Why should we pay if they benefit too?
Precisely that kind of thinking, and this deeply undermines crucial international institutions, the UN, the WHO, climate agreements, you name it.
Damn, the ultimate danger.
Most profoundly, nationalism remains one of the most potent drivers of conflict and war. By its very nature, it divides the world into us versus them. This fuels suspicion, misunderstanding, hostility. Beliefs in national superiority or victimhood can lead leaders to inflate threats, miscalculate risks, and justify the use of force, often as a way to rally domestic support.
The historical record seems pretty unambiguous on that point.
It is tragically unambiguous. Nationalism has repeatedly served as a primary ideological catalyst for organized violence on a massive, devastating scale.
Examining its consequences.
Yeah. Okay, so weighing all this, our sources really compel us to examine a critical question. Is it actually beneficial or maybe even morally justified to favor our own nation over others? It's a deep point to grapple with.
It really is. This is the core ethical issue of partiality. Now, one line of argument, what the sources call the particularist defense, suggests that such partiality is natural, maybe even necessary.
Natural how?
Like our duties to our family and friends. We naturally feel stronger obligations to those closer to us. Nations, in this view, are seen as extended families, sort of, and perhaps the most effective vehicles we have for meeting basic human needs, providing security, fostering culture.
Okay, so it's a concentric circles of loyalty, and the nation is a key circle.
That's one way to frame it. However, the universalist critique, most strongly articulated by cosmopolitanism, argues completely differently.
Which is?
It holds that all humans have equal moral worth, period, regardless of borders, nationality, ethnicity. From this perspective, granting preferential treatment based purely on nationality is essentially unjust discrimination. It's morally arbitrary.
Like discriminating based on eye color or something?
Cosmopolitans would argue it's similarly unfounded.
Hmm.
And proponents of universal human rights often point out that the shield of national sovereignty is frequently used by states precisely to justify violating the rights of their own citizens or others.
That's a powerful counterargument.
It is. And what's fascinating here is the psychological reality we touched on earlier. Our empathy, our gut feelings are much more easily mobilized for a tangible in-group, for us.
It's easier to care about people like us or people we know.
Exactly. Cosmopolitanism, while perhaps logically consistent and ethically appealing on paper, is intellectually demanding. It asks us to extend our circle of concern to an abstract humanity of billions, which is psychologically harder work.
So there's a tension between the ethical ideal and our psychological wiring.
A very strong tension.
Okay, beyond those philosophical debates, our sources lay out a pretty strong ethical case against nationalism, based purely on its real-world consequences.
Yes, particularly from a classical liberal perspective, which emphasizes individual liberty above all. From that viewpoint, nationalism is often seen as deeply problematic.
Why? What are the main charges?
Well, first, it's seen as a collectivist threat to individualism. The individual's rights, freedoms, even conscience, can be subordinated to the demands of the abstract nation. This can justify suppressing freedom of speech, dissent, anything deemed unpatriotic.
The group over the person.
Right. Second, it's seen as inherently linked to discrimination and oppression. By creating a favorite in-group, it logically creates out-groups, leading to hierarchies that marginalize or actively oppress minorities within the nation or foreigners outside it. In extreme cases, this leads down the path to ethnic cleansing or genocide.
The darkest outcomes.
Indeed. Third, from an economic standpoint, it's often seen as promoting harmful government control over the economy. Protectionist policies, trade wars, subsidies, these might sound good politically, but liberals argue they lead to inefficiency, misallocation of resources, cronyism, and ultimately economic stagnation. Less wealth for everyone.
Interfering with free markets in the name of the nation.
Exactly. And finally, nationalism can be a direct threat to democratic institutions. It tends to concentrate power in a strong state, often idolizing a single leader who claims to embody the national will. This is fundamentally antithetical to ideas of limited government, checks and balances, and peaceful transfers of power.
That's a pretty damning list of potential consequences. And our sources also warn about something called ethical nationalism. That phrase, it almost sounds like a contradiction in terms, doesn't it?
It does, and the sources suggest the concept of a purely benign, Purely ethical nationalism is highly unstable, perhaps even illusory.
Why unstable?
Well, while civic nationalism based on shared liberal values, tolerance, inclusion is appealing and seems harmless, the problem is the underlying psychological engine is still there.
That old us versus them instinct.
Exactly. That deep-seated drive for in-group preference and out-group suspicion, it's always present under the surface. And that engine can be very easily activated or reactivated by political entrepreneurs, especially during times of crisis, anxiety, or perceived threat.
So when things get tough, the good nationalism can flip.
Under pressure, yes. Seemingly benign civic nationalism can quickly collapse into more aggressive, exclusionary, even ethnic forms. The rhetoric shifts, the boundaries tighten. So the boundary between good patriotism and bad nationalism is therefore dangerously porous and highly contingent on stability and security.
It's like having a superpower that seems helpful, but under stress, it can easily turn you into a supervillain.
They're not a bad analogy, actually. The potential for misuse is always lurking. A world without nations. The grand question.
Okay, this brings us back to that really big, provocative hypothetical you posed at the start. What if humanity just stopped? Stopped identifying with nations and simply identified as human? Transcending what you called fantasy cultures, religions, etc. Would it stop wars, unite the world? Is this just a small step we could theoretically take?
It's such a compelling thought experiment, isn't it? And the argument for a unified human identity is powerful, especially, as we said, when you look at global problems like climate change or pandemics that genuinely require species-level action.
Right, problems that ignore borders completely.
Exactly. And eliminating that fundamental us versus them dynamic between nations could, in theory, seem like the obvious way to stop international war.
Seems logical.
Does. However, the analysis we've been doing, drawing on evolution, psychology, history, it provides pretty strong grounds for skepticism about this being a simple solution or even a solution at all.
Why skepticism?
Because the deep-seated human need for identity, for belonging, for security, that wouldn't just vanish if you magically erased nation-states tomorrow.
People would still need to belong to something.
Precisely. If the nation-state framework were removed, humans would likely, almost certainly, find new ways to divide themselves, new lines to draw.
Based on what?
Maybe ideology, region, class, lifestyle, religion. Who knows? The possibilities are endless. The fundamental problem of intergroup conflict, rooted in that us versus them psychology, wouldn't necessarily be solved. It would likely just be displaced onto a new, perhaps even more chaotic and fragmented set of divisions.
So the takeaway here is a world where everyone just calls themselves human might not be peacefully unified, but could actually be more chaotic than the flawed system we have now.
It's a real possibility, the sources raise. For all its manifest dangers, the nation-state system at least organizes conflict into a structured, if often violent system with certain rules, diplomacy, state actors.
It contains it somewhat.
You could argue that. A post-national world, still populated by psychologically tribal humans but lacking this established structure, could potentially devolve into something resembling Hobbes's war of all against all, but fought between countless shifting identity groups with potentially more frequent and unpredictable violence.
That's a truly sobering thought. So why isn't transcending nationalism a small step then, as might be optimistically hoped? It seems so intuitive on one level, but you're saying it's incredibly difficult, maybe impossible.
It overlooks several formidable obstacles. First, there's that evolutionary hurdle we keep coming back to.
The tribal brain.
Right. The human brain seems hardwired for in-group preference, honed over millions of years in small tribal settings. A single global in-group of 8 billion people. That's psychologically incredibly difficult, maybe impossible, to sustain as a primary identity. Group identity seems to require contrast and us needs of them.
Who would the them be for Team Human? Aliens.
Exactly. It sounds flippant,
Yeah.
but psychologically, it's a real issue. Then there's a huge psychological hurdle. The need for a concrete, meaningful identity is a fundamental human drive.
We need to know who we are.
Yes. And simply erasing deeply felt national, cultural, religious identities, identities that provide meaning, history, connection, without offering an equally compelling, emotionally resonant replacement that would create a profound psychological vacuum.
Needing to.
Probably anxiety, alienation, and likely a backlash towards new, perhaps even more extreme or narrow group identities to fill that void. People would grasp onto something.
And the practical side.
And finally, the sheer practical hurdle is staggering. The entire modern world, our laws, economies, political systems, infrastructure, is built on the scaffolding of the nation-state. Dismantling all of that. national governments, legal systems, economies. It would require a complete top-to-bottom reimagining of political authority and social organization on a planetary scale. That is, well, it's arguably the biggest step imaginable, not a small one.
And just quickly, regarding your original query that kind of dismissed cultures and religions as fantasy, this actually misunderstands their fundamental purpose from a functional perspective.
How so? They are just stories we tell ourselves.
Well, they are stories, but far from being trivial fantasies, these shared systems of meaning, culture, religion, tradition are arguably the essential software of human social existence. They're how we operate together.
Software.
Yeah, cultures provide moral codes, symbolic frameworks, shared narratives that help us make sense of the world, coordinate behavior, know what to expect from each other. Religion, in particular, has historically been a primary source of meaning, morality, and social cohesion for billions. And they create trust, don't they? That seems pretty crucial for any society to function.
They absolutely do. Shared cultures, shared norms, even shared rituals create high-trust environments, which are vital for complex cooperation. A common language, shared assumptions about behavior. It reduces friction, makes collaboration possible on a large scale.
And a single global human culture wouldn't do that.
It would likely be too thin, too abstract, too lowest common denominator to generate the same level of trust or rich textured meaning as these thicker, historically rooted specific cultures we actually live in.
So the problem isn't diversity of culture itself.
No, the sources suggest the core issue driving large-scale conflict isn't the mere existence of diverse cultures. It's nationalism, the specific ideology that insists each distinct cultural group must have its own sovereign state, and that these states are fundamentally locked in a struggle for power and dominance.
It's the politicization of cultural difference.
Exactly. The solution, therefore, isn't cultural homogenization, which is impossible and probably undesirable anyway, but rather decoupling culture from state coercion and challenging the nationalist ideology that turns cultural difference into political conflict.
Reconciling the tribe and the globe.
Okay, so if a world completely without nations isn't really feasible, or maybe even desirable, and unrestrained nationalism is clearly dangerous, what's the path forward? Where do we realistically go from here? It feels like we're stuck between a rock and a hard place.
We face a profound dilemma, truly. The current international system, based on sovereign nation-states, struggles mightily with global problems that desperately require collective solutions. This creates what analysts call a governance deficit.
A gap between the problems and the tools to solve them.
Precisely. Existing global institutions, the UN, the WTO, the World Health Organization, they exist, but they're constantly limited by nationalism. Sovereign states are often reluctant to cede real power, to pool sovereignty, or even just comply with international rulings or agreements when it doesn't suit their perceived national interest.
Right, they prioritize their own interests.
Which leads to what's fascinatingly described in the sources as a kind of chicken and egg problem.
Which is?
Strong global governance seems needed to effectively constrain the damaging aspects of nationalism. But strong nationalism prevents that effective global governance from emerging in the first place. Each blocks the other.
Okay, that's a bind.
Yeah.
So what's the pragmatic strategy then? How do you even begin to approach breaking that cycle?
Well, a realistic path forward, according to many analyses, is probably incremental. It's often called a functionalist approach.
Functionalist. Meaning practical.
Yes, starting with practical, often less politically charged areas of cooperation. Things like coordinating technical standards for industries across borders, sharing public health data transparently during a pandemic threat, collaborating on major scientific research projects like space exploration or fusion energy.
Build trust on the small stuff first.
Essentially, yes. By building habits of cooperation, mutual understanding, and institutional capacity in these less contentious domains, the hope is that trust and collaboration can gradually spill over into more difficult, politically charged areas over time.
Slow and steady.
It's an approach that acknowledges the persistent power of nationalism while patiently, persistently working to build mechanisms that can help transcend its limitations where necessary.
That makes sense as a long-term strategy.
Mm-hmm.
So beyond those big global structures, what about bottom-up approaches? What can be done within societies to maybe transform nationalism or at least mitigate its worst aspects?
That's crucial, too. The sources suggest a kind of toolkit for mitigating malignant nationalism from within. Several key elements.
Okay, like what?
First, the active promotion of inclusive civic nationalism. This means deliberately defining the nation around shared liberal democratic values, pluralism, respect for diversity, celebrating multiculturalism rather than fearing it, and strongly protecting minority rights within the law.
Shifting the definition of us.
Exactly. Second, a serious, long-term investment in education for global citizenship, cultivating empathy, critical thinking skills, a broader historical perspective, and understanding of different cultures, making citizens less susceptible to simplistic, jingoistic propaganda.
Teaching people to think globally.
And critically. Third, the deliberate fostering of intergroup dialogue and contact. Programs that facilitate positive, meaningful interaction between different ethnic, religious, or cultural groups within a society.
Why is that important?
Because positive contact helps break down stereotypes, reduce prejudice, and humanize the other. It counters that core us versus them mentality at a very fundamental personal level.
Makes the other less other.
Precisely. And finally, and this might be the most fundamental, addressing the root causes of insecurity. Malignant nationalism, the really aggressive kind, is deeply fueled by feelings of threat, anxiety, economic precarity, perceived loss of status.
People lash out when they feel vulnerable.
Often, yes. So policies that promote genuine economic security, reduce inequality, ensure access to quality healthcare and education, strengthen the rule of law, and reduce corruption. These can be powerful antidotes to the appeal of extremist nationalist narratives. They make people feel less threatened, more secure in their own lives.
It sounds like these solutions are quite indirect, in a way. They're not attacking nationalism head-on, but treating the underlying conditions that allow the bad versions to flourish.
That's exactly right. A frontal assault on national identity itself, telling people not to feel patriotic or connected to their nation, is almost guaranteed to backfire. It triggers defensiveness.
People don't like being told their feelings are wrong.
Naturally not. So more promising strategies aim to change the environment in which identities are formed, reduce those underlying feelings of precarity and threat, foster more complex, overlapping identities. People can be proud of their city, their profession, their region, and their nation, and feel connection to global issues. So that national identity is no longer the sole, all-consuming source of self-worth and security.
Diversify the identity portfolio, so to speak.
You could put it that way. The approach is to treat the underlying psychological need for identity and security, not just attack the ideological symptom of nationalism. Outro.
So, reflecting on everything, your initial query presented a powerful, but, as our deep dive really revealed, ultimately a false dichotomy. It wasn't really a choice between warring nations on one side or some kind of featureless, undifferentiated humanity on the other.
Right. Our exploration into the science of human nationalism, drawing on all these sources, it seems to show that neither of those extremes is truly desirable or probably even viable in the real world.
Exactly. Neither extreme works with human nature as we understand it.
So the takeaway here, the most plausible and maybe the most hopeful path forward, seems to lie in a kind of synthesis. What the sources might frame as a community of communities.
That's a good way to think about it. This model doesn't seek to erase national and cultural identities. It acknowledges that deep, persistent human need for belonging, for the thick ties of shared language, history, culture that give life meaning and texture. It allows for patriotism, for national pride, for cultural specificity.
Yes, it accepts those as likely enduring features of the human condition. But, and this is the crucial part, it seeks to embed these particular communities, these nations, within a thinner but stronger framework of global order.
Thinner but stronger. How?
Thinner in the sense that it doesn't provide that same thick cultural identity, but stronger in terms of enforcement and shared commitment. A framework built on a genuine, shared commitment to universal human rights, robust international law that actually has teeth, and effective global cooperation on those transnational threats we discuss.
Climate, pandemics, security.
Exactly. It requires cultivating really a kind of dual identity in people. The capacity to be a proud member of one's nation and simultaneously a responsible citizen of the planet.
Holding both identities at once.
Yes, not seeing them as mutually exclusive.
So the ultimate purpose, maybe, of digging into a science of human nationalism like this is to provide the knowledge, the understanding we need for this grand, difficult political project.
I think so. The goal isn't to somehow extinguish the fire of the tribe, that deep need for belonging. That's likely impossible and might even be undesirable. The goal is perhaps to learn how to contain that fire within the hearth of a civilized global order.
Benefiting from its warmth, the sense of community identity, without letting it burn down the whole house through conflict and xenophobia.
That's the challenge, precisely. And that, you see, requires a constant, difficult, and incredibly delicate balancing act.
Between what?
Between the particular and the universal. between our emotional attachments and our rational interests, between our ancient evolutionary inheritance, that tribal wiring, and the unprecedented global challenges of our modern world.
A balancing act for all of this, really.
It truly is. And that's perhaps a thought for you, the listener, to mull over as you navigate your own connections, your own feelings towards both the tribe, however you define it, and the globe we all share.
This is DigitView.